when we're looking for living our own life, we need to think about who's been trying to hijack it. It's been consumer culture. It's digital culture too. The average person, of course, is checking their phone 110 times a day. We're watching TV for 3 hours a day. That means if you add it all up, by the time you're 75, you will watch television for 9 years of your life continuously. Now, how does that feel?
Today's guest is Roman Krznaric. Roman is a social philosopher and author whose books include Carpe Diem Regained, Empathy, and How to Find Fulfilling Work. We discussed today with Roman how 5 minutes a day contemplating death can change your perspective, and why living each day as if you only have 6 months to live is better than living each day as if it were your last. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, get ready for this episode, Living the Life You Want to Live.
I've seen you doing interviews wearing death shirts and stuff like
Look,
this.
I've got my death t-shirt on now. Can you see it?
I can see it.
Excellent.
Well, it's got freedom and death on the front, and on the back, let me just turn around. You can't probably see that well on the back, but on the back, written 6 different ways to think about death, which represent different philosophies or thought experiments to bring death into our minds. I believe we need to have a daily death pause. Spend 5 minutes a day thinking about death, and I think that will help put your life in perspective. But death's been a subject which goes all the way through my new book, Carpe Diem Regained. I think it's pretty obvious why, because it's the flip side of freedom. How do we really live and make choices and savor those choices and care about choices unless we realize that there's an end, that there's a finality to it. So we need to have the taste of death on our lips in order to pursue the art of living. We live in a culture where death is as a taboo topic as sex was in the Victorian era. We shove the elderly out of sight and out of mind into care homes. The advertising industry tells us that we're forever young. In the 16th century, as you know, people would have skulls on their desks, memento mori, to remind them that death could come for them at any moment. But how many people have a skull on their desk now? I mean, I actually do have something. I have a little death dice, and on each side of the dice is written one of the death tasters, I call them, on the back of my t-shirt. So there's things like, live as if you had 6 months left. So looking back in your life, you'd have no regrets. Or live this day as if it were your last, which of course is the famous Stoic philosophy we can talk about. Live as if life were full of little deaths. Live as if you'd like your life to recur forever. So every morning I can roll my dice and contemplate that what side that lies up. So it's my equivalent of a skull. It's a little bit less morbid, and I can take it in my pocket anywhere.
We should make an advertisement right now at this moment to say it's only $59.99. Order now, for the dice.
These are very difficult to make. In fact, it was made by one of the readers of my book, who works in a school, and he forced the design and technology teacher to make this beautiful cube.
Brilliant. I want one. The
dice of death. There is an online version of it that has been made, and that it turns the sides randomly, and you can pause it, and one side will land up, and you can concentrate your mind on that side, or it can just help you make a decision.
No, I like it. I like the idea, and again, it's that, because I think sometimes it's even the idea of contemplating it sort of on a daily basis. It's how do you go about it, and just a little tool like that, which is quite simple, takes the decision away and just makes the contemplation a bit more random, and it just gets you to think about it almost in a less contrived way. So I like that. I think it's powerful.
It's fun actually as well. This is what I've learned about things like death, you've got to make it a bit of a laugh, as you guys no doubt do. You have some friends over for dinner and you put this on the table, and first they look at it all over, and they find it a bit weird. But in fact, it sparks extraordinary conversations because everybody is thinking about death, or if they're not, it's sublimated in our minds. As you'll know from having, I believe you interviewed Sheldon Solomon.
Yep.
Yes.
Sheldon is a great guy and a brilliant thinker about death. And all his research has shown, as you know, for years that, if you flash the word death up on a computer screen in front of somebody so fast they don't notice it, they start, for example, wanting to spend more money on fast cars and fine wine and fancy watches, because we're all obsessed with death and displace our fear into things like jobs and careers and social status and so on. It's constantly there, and it's the big one that we don't want to talk about. The potential to talk about it is huge, and I think it's interesting to find adventurous ways to have these kinds of conversations. I used to run an organization called the Oxford Muse, MUSE, okay. And it was invented to create conversations between strangers. And one of the things we did, we used to hold these conversation meals where we'd get like 100 CEOs and 100 homeless people, and we'd invite them to lunch. Oh. And instead of giving them a menu of food, we give them a menu of conversation. And we put them in pairs.
Wow.
And the menu would have questions on it like, what is your philosophy of death? Or what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? And you do the opposite of speed dating. You talk for an hour, not for a minute. These are the kinds of spaces we don't have in society to talk about death. At the moment, the only place in society we really have is a church. But a church really offers a very narrow conversational space for thinking about death.
There's the death cafe and there's the death dinners as well. This kind of movement of trying to make mortality or talking about death more common, I guess. But still, it's still a very new idea and very difficult idea to push to people. And even when you say we need to think about that for 5 minutes a day, I think you will encounter a lot of resistance, because it's not that obvious. So when you say that to people, or when you advise people to do that, how do they react generally?
When you introduce an idea like that, if you just come out of the blue, you just shout it out in the supermarket, hey, think about death for 5 minutes now. People would look at you a bit strangely. What you need to do, of course, is lead people into it and get them to understand why it might matter. So in fact, I normally introduce that idea to people after I've been talking to them for half an hour or something about Carpe Diem, seize the day, that whole idea. So I'll tell them, for example, a lot of people are familiar with that phrase, Carpe Diem or seize the day, but they may not know it goes back to the Roman poet Horace, who originally wrote a little 8-line poem about it, where the phrase comes from. And the last couple of lines of that poem really sum up what he was trying to say. He said, even as we speak, envious time flies past. Seize the day and leave as little as possible for tomorrow. In those lines, he raises that topic of death. What decision should we make given that, the time is passing, the clock is ticking? You're not going to be here forever. So what choices are you going to make? People intuitively feel that. They understand that they don't want to reach the end of their lives and be filled with regrets for having been a lawyer for 37 years. Or whatever it happens to be. Because, as you say, the rise of death cafes, the rise of public discussions about euthanasia, palliative care, and so on, these all raise in our consciousness the reality of our mortality. It isn't quite as hard as talking about it as it was, say, in my grandmother's time, when my grandmother was dying of cancer in the 1970s. She wouldn't tell anybody. She didn't tell anybody she had cancer, stomach cancer, for 15 years. And of course, in some countries like France, as I understand, doctors are still quite reluctant to tell patients that they're going to die.
Absolutely.
The culture is shifting. It's shifting slowly. But that's why I think your podcast is very important, and the work of Sheldon Solomon and so on. It's to try and shift the public conversation and to understand that even if you like a YOLO, you only live once life, well, if you really want to live once, live your life and this one time, you've got to feel the Grim Reaper over your shoulder, because that's really going to heighten the excitement of it, I think.
It's strange, as you said. It's like people I speak to about it. You get comments like you're a happy sod, or it's that kind of sarcasm, or it's other people. It's just like I really don't want to talk about this. It just freaks me out, and it's just there. But yet we'll sit down and watch films and TV shows, and people are dying everywhere. People are being murdered, and it's turned into this sort of caricature almost. And like we try and bring humor into it. You mentioned humor as well earlier. But I think it's like that caricature is almost it's a way of softening that whole thing rather than actually facing the harsh reality of it. There's an acceptance piece that isn't there. It's that we don't want to accept that we die. And I think that's the big thing around the conversations. It's how do we get that acceptance in? I mean, how would you, like with the people you talk to and work with? What do you find with people accepting it, or what struggles are there, and how do you approach it?
The main way I approach it is through talking about these 6 different ways of thinking about death, which are on the death dice. So maybe we talk about those because they're like thought experiments. They're imaginative. So, the most obvious one, which you might be able to see there, is live every day as if it were your last. Now, this was the one that was made famous, of course, as we mentioned, by Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, who said, live every day as if it were your last. And of course, it was the one made famous by Steve Jobs in his Stanford address, How to Live Before You Die, where he claimed that he would stand in front of the mirror every morning for the past 33 years and ask himself, if this were the last day of my life, would I do what I'm planning to do today? And he said, if the answer was no, too many days in a row, he changed what he was going to do. When I'm running workshops and doing talks, I get people to discuss that motto, live every day as if your last, for themselves, and to critique it. Why is that maybe actually a really terrible idea? Just because Steve Jobs did it doesn't mean we should all do it. I mean, I have a lot of problems with that idea. I don't know about you. I mean, I think partly it invokes a real kind of short-termism. Why concentrate on the day? Why live every day as if your last? Why not live every month as if it were your last, or every year, or every decade? That might invoke or encourage a different kind of thinking, like doing longer term projects but still meaningful projects, rather than blowing all your money on a £2,000 sofa, or blowing your relationship on an affair, which you might get from that live every day as if your last. Well, why not live every day as if it were your first? Like a child seeing a giraffe or snow for the first time. It could invoke a sense of wonder. And then I think a third problem with it is ethical. Just because it's your last day doesn't mean it should be everybody else's too. If you want to live every day as your last, you might think, right, I'm going to fly everywhere around the world and bungee jump on off every great cliff or every great bridge. But what about the carbon emissions? What about the impact on your family? What about the wider moral responsibility we have? Why shouldn't we all get to live our days if it were your last, or to think about it more in a collective sense? So I think there's some issues with it. I mean, on the other hand, my dad is elderly. He's 83 or 84. And whenever I see him, he lives in Australia, I live in England, I try to treat every day as if it were our last together. Not in a morbid way, but just to really look him in the eye, and we laugh more and cry more and do everything more. And in that sense, I think it's a good thing.
I like that, just that little flip on it. It's like, it's live each day as if it was everyone else's last day, because that just changes how you treat everybody. And it gives a shift in yourself as well. I don't know. It said the other one can live each day as if you last can have a tendency to push people towards a more hedonistic sort of panic at the end, where they're just trying to get every ounce of pleasure in. Maybe though, but I mean, I'd question that as well. In that, if it was, I think there might be a few who would do that, but I think many people would choose to spend it with loved ones, with family, with what really matters. Maybe they would leave. They'd come out of the office. They'd go home and spend it with family. So there is a danger there, but I think underneath it all, when people really look at it, I think they. And this is the hope, I think, because I think most people have that value in them of what is really important. We do know it, but we get caught up in the race. We get caught up in the trap. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit too optimistic about people, but I actually think the majority of people, that is there, but it's just sort of covered up. And the contemplation will remove that cover.
I agree with that. And of course, most people aren't going to go and blow everything on the final day. And of course, the Stoic philosophers, when they said live every day as if it your last, that isn't what they weren't implying a kind of big hedonistic blowout. It was more about savoring the day and the moments of the day. The idea of, the way people say they'll go and spend it with their loved ones, I find that a little bit limiting. But let me just try and explain why.
Yeah.
Of course, if we only had a little bit of time left, we'd spend it with our loved ones. But to me, that's not very interesting. The interesting thing to me is, what are you going to do after you've spent all the time you're going to spend with your kids or your partner or your parents? And that's why I quite like the idea of live every day as if you've got 6 months left. And when I get people to think about this, I get them to imagine you spent as much time as you're going to with your kids and your family. Okay, that's done. Now, what are you going to do with the 6 months? What great project are you going to do? For example, in my book, Carpe Diem Regained, I discussed the amazing Japanese film directed by Kurosawa called Ikiru, Ikiru, which means to live. That is, to me, one of the top 11 Carpe Diem films of all time. It's set in late post-war Tokyo, about 1950. There's a Japanese bureaucrat. He's bored. He's got 6 months left to live. He's got stomach cancer. The question is, what is he going to do? And he starts by hiding under under his duvet, under his blankets, and wants to commit suicide. Then he tries a wild hedonistic blowout, dancing with random women and drinking all night with a rakish novelist. And then in the end, decides to do a single act for the public good in his last 6 months. He works like crazy to help some poor women living in the slums of Tokyo to build a children's playground. And he helps them fight the bureaucrats and the politicians and the gangsters. And in the end of the film, he dies, it's a bit of a spoiler, swinging in the playground, in the snow, singing that, life is short, and he dies happy. And what's it about there? It's about a project, what the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl called a sort of a transcendent cause, a will, something where you have a will to meaning, something outside yourself that gives your life meaning in the face of death. Nietzsche said, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. And I think that is very, very fundamental. All those studies of what people who are dying say that they regret. Like there's a famous one by Bronnie Ware, 5 top regrets of dying. And people say, oh, I wish I'd spent, being more open about my emotions and spent more time with my loved ones and so on. What I think is missing from those lists is the idea of making a difference in the world, making a mark on the world, and things like building that playground for those children. That a lot of people's regrets are very internal or very emotional, very much about their family. Of course, that's real, but the problem is people are being interviewed for those things when they tend to be in a hospice, when they are dying, when they're at their most isolated and at their most vulnerable. I don't want to spend all my life just hugging my children, much as I love them. I think that's important to widen out what we think we might feel or want to do in the face of death.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I just sort of felt that a little pop in my own sort of idea around that, and just a widening, because it is more about that. And I think this is where it comes into the Sheldon Solomon stuff, just about, because even all those regrets, if you think about it, what Sheldon Solomon's saying is everyone sort of closes ranks. Everything that's closer to you becomes more important. It actually fits in with those regrets, which you said are more internalized. They're closer. But there is that whole that meaning that we bring to our life, but what we do, which is, as you said, it's how do we make our mark? What's bigger? What's more external? So
I'm just wondering, the very first regret of a dying from Bronnie Ware, she mentioned, I wish I would have lived the life I wanted, not the life they wanted for me. So is it beyond that? By living the life I really wanted, I would have built this legacy. I would have built this project. I would have done exactly what I really wanted to. So I'm just wondering if this first regret of the dying is kind of what you're just mentioning about, like, this project.
That is a very interesting thought. I've never thought of that, because I think you're right that the implication of that first one, as she writes about, is, in a sense, that people feel they've been inauthentic in some way,
Yeah.
that they have followed the rules. Now, those rules could be about climbing the company ladder or having a nice house and wearing the right clothes and so on. This, in a way, goes back to the great existential philosophers, about the idea of freedom and authenticity and so on.
Yeah.
And I think now the question is, what would people have otherwise done with leading a more authentic life? Would they have followed the social rules less and not worked as an accountant and earned enough money to buy the nice house and instead gone and opened an otter sanctuary in the southwest of England? Or would they have gone and become a doctor and work in sub-Saharan Africa? We don't know. I guess the point, going back to that Nietzsche thing, he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how, is it doesn't really matter what your transcendent cause is, that thing, as long as it's sort of outside the immediate boundary of the ego. It has to be something outside you that keeps you going. It's basically not enough for human beings just to follow their own self-interest. In the end, you don't feel alive enough. Gordon Gekko tried very hard in Wall Street, but even for him, I think there was a hollowness to life in the end. I mean, one of the ways I like thinking about this is imagining yourself at a dinner party in the afterlife. This is a way of thinking about death. So imagine yourself, you're at a dinner party in the afterlife, and the other guests are all the other yous who you could have been if you had made different choices. So there's the you who decided to leave your relationship and go off with somebody else. There's the you who had a car crash and almost died. There's the you who actually studied really hard and became a vet and lived out your dream. You who was always and unceasingly niggling your brother or sister and always being mean to them even when you were an adult, whatever. And the question is, which of these yous do you want to talk to? Which of these yous do you find annoying? Which of these yous would you rather be or become? In that variety of possible yous, it's quite a good thought experiment. I say, well, maybe I don't have to be living how I'm living now. Maybe I'd rather meet or be that other me.
It still comes down to this pressure, as you mentioned, is from your internal search for meaning and purpose that come from this inside, from your guts, to the pressure that you encounter from societies to conform to this system, I guess. So I think there's a battle, and the ally, I think this is what you mentioned, is death behind. The ally is this powerful figure of death, of mortality, that says, well, look, yes, there's the system that conforms you into a way, but at the end you still die. So what do you want, really?
Partly why I've written my book all about Carpe Diem, because on the one side we need to think about death, on the other side we need to think about freedom. In my book, I explored different ways of thinking about freedom, or Carpe Diem, that phrase, seize the day. Throughout human history, humankind has discovered 5 ways of thinking about Carpe Diem. One of them is about grasping opportunities that might disappear and be lost forever. Another one is about spontaneity, sort of breaking the schedule, being experimental in how we live. A third way is Carpe Diem as hedonism, about seeking pleasures from free love to gastronomic extravagance. A fourth way is through the idea of presence, the idea of being in the here and now. That's how we seize our days. And a fifth way is what I call political Carpe Diem. That's where you take the other 4, opportunity, presence, spontaneity, and hedonism, and you take them from the individual to the collective level to bring about social change. So think of the protesters who helped bring down the Berlin Wall in 1989. It was spontaneous action. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, historic opportunity. They were in the present, and they were also partying. It was full of hedonism alongside very serious intentions. But what's happened is that these different ways of seizing the day have been hijacked by modern culture. So, for example, in a way, I think they're being captured partly by the idea of seizing opportunities has been captured by consumer culture. Just do it has really become just buy it. Instead of seizing the day, we're seizing the credit card. It's all become about Black Friday shopping sprees and the instant hit of one-click online buying. And I doubt that Horace, the poet of Carpe Diem, would have really thought that seizing the day was all about getting a bargain down at the Forum. Freedom has really become a choice between brands, as we know. Nike and Adidas, iPhone and Samsung. What kind of choices are those? This is the tragedy of our era. And so, as you say, Olivier, when we're looking for living our own life, we need to think about who's been trying to hijack it. It's been consumer culture. It's digital culture too. The average person, of course, is checking their phone 110 times a day. We're watching TV for 3 hours a day. That means if you add it all up, by the time you're 75, you will watch television for 9 years of your life continuously. How does that feel?
Feels shit, if you tell me. How do you live differently now? If you with these death reminders, how is it different from you compared to previously, I guess, when you didn't do that?
I'm much more willing to engage in big life projects. While I've been doing this research on death, I've made some decisions to do things that I was afraid of previously doing. So, for example, in my last book, which was on the topic of empathy, and it was called, unsurprisingly, Empathy, I had this idea at the end of the book to found the world's first empathy museum. And then I wrote the book and went around the world giving public lectures, and everyone said, "So, where's your empathy museum then?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." But while I was thinking about writing this book about Carpe Diem and death, that's when I finally decided to overcome my fears and found this empathy museum, which now exists. You can look at it online, empathymuseum.com. It travels around the world. It's about to go to Brazil and Ireland and other places. What I learned from that really was ultimately about, in the face of death, to follow a single motto, which is act first, think later. The Enlightenment tradition of thought has always told us to do things the other way around. Think, then act. In other words, you have to make a big life decision, like whether to change career. Then you're supposed to go to a careers counselor, write down your strengths and weaknesses, do lots of research, narrow down the options, and then start sending off your resume, your curriculum vitae. Now, that will get you a job, but it's unlikely to be a deep, fulfilling and meaningful one because you haven't tried things out in reality. Of course, you haven't done shadowing or volunteering. You don't know. In other words, what the research shows is that if you want to find fulfilling work, instead of thinking then acting, you need to act first and think later. And I think this is at the essence of the art of living and the art of dying. It's about being experimental with the way we live. And what I learned thinking about death was that experiential living, that word experience comes from the Latin experimentum, which is experiment. And within that is another little Latin word, periculum, which means danger. Is recognizing that we tumble, we fall. And in fact, life is full of these little deaths and little failures, things disappearing. If we recognize that we're only in our 20s once, and when we turn 30, our 20s die, then we are going to live our 20s more. And this is how I feel, having thought now a lot about death and talked to a lot of people about it. I feel these moments of life disappearing every moment. So it gives me the courage to do things like start an empathy museum. It makes me play more with my kids. They're only going to be 8.5 once and obsessed with football once or whatever it is. So be with them now, because that moment will disappear and be lost forever. It will die. In a way, that's a Buddhist idea of impermanence. Live as if life were full of little deaths. I haven't become someone who does parachute jumps every weekend. Now, it's not about that. It's about a deeper sense of constantly asking myself, what does a meaningful life look like? I mean, I'm about to decide what to write my next book about. It's going to take the next 3 years of my life, or maybe longer. These are massive decisions. And if I die in the middle of writing that book, I don't want to feel it was a mistake. But I can only make that decision if I, in a way, know that it might be the wrong decision. I'm not going to keep putting it off. Otherwise, you just keep putting it off, really. If you're so afraid of a tumble, of that risk, of that fall, you'll never act now and think later. So ultimately, I'm thinking about it in a slightly new way now, thanks to this conversation. Both freedom and death are about the acceptance of risk, not just the risk of you dying. It's the risk of anything going wrong. And once you can get that into your worldview, then you're going to truly live differently, and you will truly embrace both freedom and death, as my t-shirt says, if you can see that there.
$20.
People always ask me after my talks. I've just been in the Netherlands for 4 days. I had hundreds of Dutch people wanting this shirt, but I wouldn't let them take it off my back. There are only 10 in existence. It's a very rare. It'll hopefully go into the Museum of Death that you will one day set up, I hope.
I think we will do that, I think, one day.
Do that for me. Will you set up a Museum of Death?
I think there's some more fears that we need to battle. I need to battle, I guess, but maybe one day.
I think our first fear is just getting a death workshops off the ground. I think that's the first one. It's just like to get that. And I think we might have to create one of your dice for it, because it's like it would be perfect.
If you look in my book, Carpe Diem Regained, there it is. Inside, I've got a cut-out death dice. Wait, thinking about death. So you can just
Perfect.
copy that sheet and make one yourself.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.